Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 284, Islam Makhachev defeated Alexander Volkanovski to retain his lightweight title. And since this fight ended, there has been a lot of controversy surrounding Makhachev versus Volkanovski. You have people claiming that Volkanovski got robbed and should have been crowned the new UFC lightweight champion at UFC 284. You have teammate of Volkanovski, Dan Hooker, making massive accusations that Islam Makhachev cheated to gain an advantage in the lead up to UFC 284. You have Ali Abdelaziz, who is the manager of Islam Makhachev, tweeting out potentially incriminating Islam Makhachev. There is some people saying that Ali Abdelaziz admitted that Islam Makhachev cheated in the lead up to UFC 284. We're going to look at Ali Abdelaziz tweets. I'm going to give my thoughts on them. And then you also have a bunch of different reporters reporting on the rules. And there's all this different information. It's like everyone's saying something different. We're going to take a look at Okamoto's tweets. We're going to take a look at Ariel Helwani's tweets. We're going to take a look at Jeff Novitzky's tweets, who is the vice president for the UFC of the health and performance for the fighters. Essentially, he is a liaison between the UFC fighters and the USADA, policy, and he oversees all the anti-doping things that go on and works between USADA and the fighters. We're going to take a look at what he has to say. We're going to take a look at the actual USADA policy, and we're also going to take a look at Australia's Athletic Commission's rules, because none of that may actually matter. So we're going to look over it all. I'm going to give you guys clarity of what the actual rules are, because I think a lot of people are confused of what the actual rules are. So before I get into anything, I've already made a bunch of videos on UFC 284. I will link the entire playlist down in the description if you guys want to go check that out. And also, if you enjoy these types of videos, do me a favor, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. I would greatly appreciate it. So what is currently going on with the whole Islam Makhachev cheating situation? Well, just to quickly recap, you have Dan Hooker, teammate of Alexander Volkanovski. He put out a series of tweets. I'm not going to read them all to you, but he essentially said that Islam Makhachev hired a nurse to rehydrate using an IV in the lead up to UFC 284. So for those of you who are not familiar with that, essentially it was believed that using an IV to rehydrate was banned by USADA. It used to be pre-USADA. People would cut a lot of weight. After the weigh-ins, they would then use an IV to rehydrate because it was faster than orally rehydrating. But the problem with that is some people use that to mask PED use. So USADA, supposedly, we were under the impression that it was banned, and people were saying essentially Islam Makhachev, who is considered a bigger lightweight, cut a massive amount of weight to make the weight for 155 for UFC 284, and then afterwards, Dan Hooker is claiming that Islam Makhachev used an IV to rehydrate because it was faster, and that way he would be back to full health and full body weight for his fight at UFC 284 against Alexander Volkanovski. That's essentially the claims. When Dan Hooker put this out, and if you check out the other video I made, you'll hear me say this exact same thing. When Dan Hooker put this out, he put it out with virtually no evidence. And, is there evidence now? Maybe, maybe not. We're going to talk about that here in a second. But the only thing Islam Makhachev has said on the matter so far is he tweeted out, "You must be held accountable for such accusations." Now, I don't even know. That might be Ali tweeting from Islam Makhachev's account. But Islam is right. If you are making false accusations and setting narratives with no evidence, you should be held accountable for that. Now, I don't know what should happen to Dan Hooker, but if this does end up bearing nothing, if there's no evidence proving that Islam Makhachev cheated, then you should have some type of punishment for Dan Hooker. And I know there's people out there saying, well, in some of the UFC pictures, you had marks on Islam Makhachev's arm. First off, that literally could have been anything. Second off, there is a mandatory blood test by the commission the week leading up to the fight. And also, why would those marks be on his arm earlier in fight week? So essentially, those pictures were taken before the weigh-ins. Most of the pictures that I've seen circulating were before the weigh-ins. So why would he be rehydrating before he even cut the weight? Makes absolutely no sense. So I think those are meaningless in terms of the pictures. I think you have social media detectives on the case, and I think those are not evidence at all. But, okay, even if those pictures are potentially real and they were after the weigh-ins, someone could have literally photoshopped the mark on the arm. You know what I mean? So essentially, the mark itself is not real. I'm just saying that's not real evidence. You need actual hardcore evidence to prove that a champion is cheating. That's a massive accusation. But let's move on. Ali Abdelaziz puts out a tweet and then deletes it. He says, for all the idiots out there, any fighter under the UFC banner can take 2 to 3 liters of IV as long as it's done by a nurse or professional. Next week, I'm going to expose everyone. Islam Makhachev is the pound for pound king. So this is very bizarre for Ali, and it's not a good look. Well, it's not bizarre for Ali considering, he does this type of dumb stuff all the time. But I'm saying this was a very poor choice of words. He should have just kept his mouth shut. While this does not admit any cheating by Islam Makhachev, it's not a good look. People are saying Ali Abdelaziz admits that Islam Makhachev cheated. There was nothing in there of him admitting that Islam Makhachev cheated. He said, for all the idiots out there, any fighter under UFC banner can take 2 to 3 liters of an IV as long as it's done by a nurse or professional. We're going to fact check that in a second because there's some people who also have a big presence in the MMA community who are saying the complete opposite. But Ali, under no circumstances, admits that Islam cheated, okay? He just says, here's the rules. Now, do I think it's a bad look to tweet this out and then say Islam Makhachev is pound for pound king? Yes, I do, because it connects those two things. And I think that's why Ali Abdelaziz subsequently deleted the tweet, because it was a horrible look. Now, you also have Brett Okamoto, who works for ESPN. He put out there a series of tweets, and I'll read them to you. There seems to be a misunderstanding across the sport on prohibited or non-prohibited use of IVs. I myself was not completely aware of this until the latest high-profile example accusation from UFC 284. I sought further clarification, and here's the bottom line. If an athlete is administered an IV of more than the permitted 100 milliliters, as long as it's done by a licensed professional, it is not a violation. Even in cases where dehydration caused by a weight cut is the issue being treated. In other words, IVs used to treat severe dehydration caused by cutting weight are not really banned as long as a physician is the one to justify and perform it. So now you have essentially Brett Okamoto, who works for the UFC, who works for ESPN. Now he's saying if a medical professional performs the IV, it is not banned under USADA's policy. Well, wait a second. That seems different than what everyone else is saying. So what's actually going on here? We're going to check that out in a second because we're going to take a look at USADA's actual policy here in a second. But it seems that Brett Okamoto and Ali Abdelaziz is on the same page. Now, take that for what you will, and we're going to get to the bottom of it here in a second. But I do want to mention that Brett Okamoto is essentially a mouthpiece for the UFC as well as Ali Abdelaziz. Brett Okamoto is not independent. He's a glorified publicist for the UFC, and he also has a very good working relationship with Ali Abdelaziz. That's why he always does the interviews with Dominance MMA fighters, because Brett Okamoto, you'll never see him put out a poor story really on the UFC or Dominance MMA fighters. So he's not really a reliable source on this subject. Now you have Ariel Helwani. He quoted a tweet with someone asking him, Ariel, do you have any thoughts on Ali tweeting and deleting this? And posted the tweet I showed you earlier. Ariel Helwani says, yes, he deleted it because someone I would think told him he was incriminating himself with the tweet. You can't take 2 to 3 liters by a professional or not. It's 100 milliliters per 12 hours, among other details. Massive difference. So now you have Ariel Helwani saying the complete opposite of Ali Abdelaziz as well as Brett Okamoto. So which is it? We're going to take a look at USADA's actual policy details here in a second. Now you have another tweet from Ali Abdelaziz, the manager of Islam Makhachev. He is quoting a tweet by Damon Martin, who works for MMA Fighting. Well, first of all, the quote from Damon Martin is, well, first of all, the burden of proof is on the person making the accusation because nobody has provided anything yet that shows Makhachev took an IV of any size. Ali Abdelaziz says, brother, these people making up stuff is shocking to me. Islam did not do an IV. If he wanted to do it, we would do it the legal way. So many fighters didn't even know they can actually use an IV. Wednesday, I'm going to embarrass everyone. Stay tuned. So you have Ali Abdelaziz saying, look, most people don't even know that you can take an IV, and Makhachev didn't take an IV anyway, which looks awfully suspicious. You have Damon Martin. I agree with what he said, But Damon Martin is also a mouthpiece for Ali Abdelaziz. There was a recording of Ali, a couple months ago saying, I own Damon Martin. Damon Martin, does work for Ali Abdelaziz in an indirect way and gives him good press. Therefore, he can get access to Ali's fighters. So you can't really trust anything Damon Martin says. But in this case, what he's saying is accurate. The burden is on the person making the accusation. You can't just throw out an accusation with no evidence and expect it. Oh, well, this is true. I don't have any evidence, but this is true. Now, let's take a look at what Jeff Novitzky has to say. He works for the UFC. He is the vice president of health and performance for the fighters, essentially the guy who works between the UFC fighters and USADA. Okay, Jeff Novitzky puts out a series of tweets that says UFC anti-doping programs IV rule was modified in 2019. Athletes, manager, and support have recommended multiple advisories on this rule change beginning in 2019. All UFC ADP rules have been publicly posted since 2015. The IV rule advisories include the following. The following IVs are now permitted without a TUE, which is a therapeutic use exemption. But he lists reasons why you would not need to get that therapeutic use exemption. And the list includes those recommended in the course of a hospital treatment, surgical procedures, clinical diagnosis, investigations. Then he also lists those recommended from a licensed medical professional after a licensed physician determines they are medically justified. Then he goes on to say, IVs of less than a total of 100 milliliters per 12-hour period. That's another list. Then he says, separate of the UFC ADP rules, athletic commissions require any athletes who receives an IV during fight week to obtain permission from the commission before receiving an IV and disclose use of the IV to the commission after its use. He goes on and says more, but I think the main things you guys need to realize is, what are the exceptions to the rules? And the main one is those recommended from a licensed medical professional after a licensed physician determines that it's medically justified. I think that is the one thing you really need to key in on, because essentially you have a scenario where if anyone goes to a doctor dehydrated, it can be medically justified and you are able to take an IV. And this shows that Ariel Helwani's tweets saying you can't take 2 to 3 liters by professionals or not, it's 100 milliliters per 12 hours. That's completely false. You can take 100 milliliters per 12 hours without any exemption. You don't need to report it to anyone. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to get a medical professional to take 100 milliliters. But that's such a small amount. Nobody's ever going to do that. Ariel's dead wrong. He misinterpreted somewhere along the way. And Jeff Novitzky says, basically, you can take an IV as long as it's medically justified. Well, Jeff Novitzky, he's not necessarily USADA. He does kind of work in between them. What's the actual rule in USADA's policy? So I went and I said, let's pull up USADA's policy. And USADA's policy says, what's the IV rule? He says all IV infusions, or USADA says, all IV infusions or injections of more than 100 milliliters per 12 hours period are prohibited at all times. So essentially anything over 100 milliliters is prohibited, both in and out of competition. For those of you who don't know what that means, it basically means the period closer to your fight. So if you don't have a fight lined up or you're months and months away from a fight, that would be considered out of competition. Closer to the fight is considered in competition, except for those received or legitimately received in or out of competition in the course of a hospital treatment, surgical procedures, clinical diagnosis investigations, or those received that are determined to be medically justified and within the standard of care by a licensed physician and administered by a licensed medical professional without an approved therapeutic use exemption. So essentially, Jeff Novitzky reiterated exactly, almost word for word, USADA's policy. And what this means is, if you're cleared by a doctor to take an IV, if they deem it medically necessary, you can take an IV all day. There is no limit to using an IV if it is medically cleared. That is what USADA's policy is. I was not aware of this up until recently, but essentially, Ariel Helwani's wrong. You have Ali Abdelaziz. The original tweet is right, because 2 to 3 liters, they can take whatever they want if deemed medically necessary. And this is where I think the UFC really needs to be more clear with these rules, because I feel like I understand why they're given this exemption. Essentially, if somebody has a medical case pop up, they might need an IV. And so they need to go get an IV and they can't be suspended for such. But I feel like this is a loophole in the game where people can still use IVs and get away with it. And I don't know what the answer is, but there's been so much information being sent out there and people are not understanding the actual rule. Ariel Helwani was dead wrong. He's saying you can only get up to 100 milliliters essentially if medically justified. That's not the case at all. Brett Okamoto was right. Ali Abdelaziz was right. And Jeff Novitzky obviously is right according to the USADA policy. But it's still a loophole and it still does not look good. But again, there's still no evidence that Islam Makhachev even broke the rule. Even if the rule did exist where, even by a medical professional, even if it was still illegal, there's no actual hardcore evidence that Islam Makhachev broke a rule. But there is one kind of exemption to that. You have the Australian Commission. There is this circulating out there. Apparently, according to the Australian Athletic Commission, they're not allowed for an IV for anything. You have, and I'm going to read the important parts of this. The commission also prohibits the use of intravenous therapies, which are used for aiding rehydration from excessive or deliberate dehydration. And I want to read something above that as well. In the interest of contestant safety, the commission prohibits the use of heat suits, sauna, and an other device which purposely increases the body temperature to dehydrate contestants. So essentially what this is saying, and this was kind of weird. I actually went and looked on their website and it was like their strategy and they were going to use it for 12 months and then reevaluate in October of 2021. I couldn't find any update if they changed this policy or not. So as far as I understand, this is the policy. So according to the Australia Athletic Commission, if Islam Makhachev used an IV, it would be illegal in accordance with the commission, regardless if they were medically exempt. It was medically justified by a licensed physician. According to the Australia Commission, it would still be illegal. But what I find weird about this, and what I found weird about this entire thing when I was looking through their website, okay, so they also prohibit heat suits, saunas. You can't even use a sauna to cut weight. So I'm wondering how much of these rules are actually enforced. Because if saunas are illegal for weight cutting, they might need to turn everyone's fight to a no contest after UFC 284. Because a lot of those fighters, I guaranteed, were using heat suits. I guarantee a lot of them were using saunas. That's one of the main ways that people cut weight in the sport of MMA. So I don't know 100% accuracy because, again, they said they were going to review these after a 12-month period, which ended October 2021. But this is what's on their website. So to recap all that, according to USADA, if it is medically justified, you can use an IV to rehydrate. It does not matter the amount of the IV. It doesn't have to be under 100 milliliters like Ariel Helwani said. He's dead wrong. According to the Australian Commission, you cannot use an IV for any reason. But you also can't use a heat suit or sauna. So to wrap this all up, we still have no evidence that Islam Makhachev used an IV outside of some pictures from some social media detectives where people are saying, oh, he definitely used it because of this mark on his arm, which we don't even know if the pictures are legitimate. We don't know if they were photoshopped, and we don't know exactly the time frame of when they were taken. The ones I seen taken were from the earlier in the week fight week, so they were long before the weigh-ins, but who knows, there might be some other pictures that I missed. That's the only evidence. Dan Hooker and his team, if they're going to say that Islam Makhachev cheated, which is a massive accusation, they need to provide evidence. When Alexander Volkanovski's head coach, Eugene, was pressed on the issue, he provided no evidence. Now, I just think this is an overall bad look for everyone because now people are labeling Islam Makhachev as a cheater when there's absolutely no evidence. Just because Ali Abdelaziz tweeted out something that didn't look particularly good, that's not evidence, okay? That's not evidence, guys. That's not going to hold up. That's essentially, saying, you can say whatever you want and then say, oh, well, this is the way I understood it. He was reiterating a rule. And I don't even like Ali Abdelaziz. He was basically saying, even if my fighter did break such policy or did do such a thing, it's not even illegal under the USADA rules. That's what Ali Abdelaziz said. He deleted it. It's a bad look for sure. But I think even though this whole thing is a bad look for Islam Makhachev, because I think there is a lot of people out there, and I've talked about it time and time again, that just hate Islam Makhachev. that hate a lot of the Dagestani fighters and also are pissed off because Alexander Volkanovski had a very good performance and ultimately didn't get the win. So I think a lot of people are out there are doing everything in their power to try to delegitimize Islam Makhachev's win over Alexander Volkanovski. And I hate this entire situation because you have one of the greatest super fights of all time. You have two guys whose stock should be going through the roof. And instead, for one fighter, we're talking about a potential cheating scandal and there's no evidence behind it. And then for the other fighter, him and his camp just look salty that they lost. So you take a moment at UFC 284 where everything should have been looking good in the MMA world. Both guys' stock should have been shot through the roof. And instead, now there's kind of a soilment to both of their names, you know. It's not looking good for Islam Makhachev or Alexander Volkanovski because people are doing this. You know, it just looks like Islam Makhachev is now a cheater. People are going to run with that narrative forever. And it looks like Alexander Volkanovski is salty. And that is a terrible case coming out of UFC 284. And we really just have to stop talking about it. Unless there's any legitimate evidence provided, we have to just stop giving it attention. I didn't even want to make this video, but I've seen a lot of people were confused on the topic. And, you know, I wanted to provide some clarity to the situation. But again, there's still no evidence that Makhachev cheated at all. Dan Hooker throwing out baseless claims. If I was Islam Makhachev, I would come out and say Dan Hooker uses steroids. And when somebody said, well, where's your evidence? I'd be like, just trust me. Just trust me, bro. Because that's essentially what Dan Hooker has done in this situation. And he's soiled an amazing performance by both guys at UFC 284. And I hate that this entire situation has erupted after one of the greatest fights of all time and the best super fight of all time, in my opinion. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. I really do believe that the UFC needs to have some clarity to these rules. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.